I want to talk about what are we referring to when we use religious vocabulary on Habermas and theology, because mostly what this is basically a chapter from my thesis, which engages with some secondary literature surrounding basically this triple volume Jürgen Habermas, also History of Philosophy, which was just translated in 23, 24, and 25. Thankfully, it was originally published in 2018. And basically what this work represents is Habermas taking his own philosophy and then building this massive kind of backstory, which goes all the way back to the basically to the Stone Age, and kind of articulating how we went from ritual, kind of from dancing around the fire, all the way to post-metaphysical philosophy. That's the basic idea here. But what Habermas offers here is basically a couple of new arguments concerning his own philosophy of religion. And what my thesis does is basically critiquing these arguments in the philosophy of religion based on some contemporary phenomenology. I basically argue that Habermas is inattentive to some dimensions of lived faith. And so what I'm presenting today is basically one chapter where I'm trying to kind of find a crack in the argument that Habermas presents in respect to religious vocabulary and how that relates to the objective world, basically. And so the first thing I want to do is kind of lay out the Habermasian ontological position, which is relevant if you want to understand why I argue, along with Martin Breuil, why he kind of goes wrong concerning what religious language refers to. And the first argument here is that Habermas basically has kind of a language pragmatic conception of how we disclose the world. So he starts with what he terms the objective world. And the objective world is not the Kantian kind of thing in itself, but it's really just a pragmatic axiom or a pragmatic assumption of the fact that there must be some kind of base reality that we always assume when we communicate about the world. And so that is, as Breuil here says, so this is a theologian that I will engage with now, Breuil says that Habermas assumes that the realistic supposition of a subject in language-independent uniformity of the world is an indispensable prerequisite for communication-oriented action, right? So this is our base layer. And what follows from this is that we can kind of follow Habermas into then what he calls realism without representation, where he says, well, we have different vocabularies, for example, science, for example, philosophy, but it could also be just some kind of day-to-day way of talking about the world, which allows us to disclose the objective world in particular ways into our life worlds, right? So if you have a particular expertise in some kind of subject, you might be able to perceive things in the objective world or to pick out on those which might elude other people who do not know this vocabulary, and that's an instance where we can see that the vocabulary you use also kind of tools your perception towards the objective world in a specific way. And the basic argument here is thus that there is a realism in the sense that the objective world does allow you to speak about specific phenomena, and these phenomena are real because you're able to talk about them in a productive fashion. At the same time, we are not representing one kind of true thing that would exist without language, because there are multiple ways in which we can disclose one and the same phenomena. The essential argument now is that Habermas argues that base reality or the objective world does give us some kind of crash barriers. This is Breuil's term, I think this is really good. He argues that we can disclose the world in multiple different ways, but at the same time, not all the vocabularies that we might apply to the objective world are equally valid, right? So we can't disclose, a chair as a car, for example, because that's just not a pragmatically useful way of understanding a chair, right? And so the argument is that we can use different vocabularies, but only to the extent that they allow us to pragmatically navigate the world that we're actually in. And so the question that this raises is, why isn't religious vocabulary one vocabulary among other vocabularies that we can use to disclose the world? And Habermas has a whole theory about this. He says that religious vocabulary basically breaks the baseline, the ontological baseline of realism without representation, because it does not relate to the objective world in the same way that, for example, science or philosophy or folk psychology or any other vocabulary relates to the objective world. Why doesn't it do so? Habermas argues that religious vocabulary effectively posits an additional entity outside of the objective world, right? So we have base reality, and then we have a divinity that's somehow outside of this. And so he has a very classically theist picture, but here, of course, he has a little bit more of a sophisticated argument here, which is that this theism is not only encoded in the theoretical assertions of religion, but it's also specifically alive and well until today in ritual, right? And so there's this Habermas quote here, which I just briefly read out. So what sets religion apart from reason in its own eyes is that it cannot be subsumed into the epistemic worldviews and ethics. Rather, its internal connection with cult and community formation endows religion with a solidarizing force that a practical reason honed down to the deontological dimension lacks. Even if it only survives as a thorn in the flesh of modernity, liturgical practice, which has become alien, is keeping the memory of a powerful awareness of transcendence alive for its secular environment. And so it's kind of interesting because for Habermas, this is not necessarily something entirely negative. The whole point of also history of philosophy is kind of arguing that perhaps religion is onto something here. He's kind of saying, well, maybe in the community-inspiring force of, say, going to mass, there's something that we can still learn, that even a post-metaphysical philosopher can still learn about how community is formed, right? But at the same time, he says that precisely because ritual is kind of oriented towards a divinity, towards something that's outside of the objective world, so this powerful awareness of transcendence, that's what makes it impossible to subsume religious vocabulary among other categories in realism without representation. And so this is the kind of the argument that I want to challenge, and I'm using Martin Boyle's argument here, and then I will proceed to kind of defend this argument and then give an example of how we can proceed if we don't accept the Habermasian account. So what Boyle argues now is that Habermas just basically takes one step too far. If he accepted his own position, he could speak about religious subject matters without at the same time needing to posit an extra objective world divinity. So what he argues is concretely, the adequacy of the Christian speaking of God's action does not demonstrate itself in the proof of the rational superiority of a theistic cosmology, but in a performance-theoretical explanation of the speaking of God's action. Within a realism without representation, the sentence is an act of God as an interpretation of reality that competes with other interpretations of reality and whose rational plausibility can be argued about with reasons. So what Boyle basically does is he takes his first step into this direction of arguing, well, perhaps there's a mistake here in thinking that there's an objective world and there's a kind of a God outside of that, and what we need to do is firstly argue what the relation between the divinity and the objective world is, and then we kind of continue thinking about, well, how would that manifest in our day-to-day lives? But what he says is we need to turn this whole thing around and we need to start thinking about things that happen to us in our day-to-day life, and the question whether we can usefully speak about these things in terms of, for example, a divine action, right? So you might think, I will give concrete examples, but you might think, for example, of a call of conscience or a birth as a miracle, something like this, right? So these instances where we have a very kind of epiphanic experience, and I think if any of you, we talked about this in the break, if any of you have read Sophie Grace Chappelle's work on epiphanies, this kind of experience of having a striking moment of recognition or understanding, something like this is potential candidate for understanding or for using religious vocabulary. And so, yeah, basically what I want to do now is kind of think firstly about how Habermas responds to this challenge, and then secondly, defending Boyle's account further. So naturally, Habermas violently, vigorously negates this position, right? He really doesn't buy this at all, and so he has a response in the same kind of monograph where Boyle published this article, and he writes, "In this transfer of the pragmatic model of knowledge from the natural to the divine reality, whose contradiction man is supposed to encounter in critical experiences of his life story, in a similar way to the resistance of nature that falsifies our assumptions in research practice, the realistic point of a similarly unambiguous equivalent experience in communicative dealings with God for the failure of the causality of nature is missing, however." And then he continues, "This is because a possible empirical examination and falsification of interpretations that attribute the unexpected occurrence of a historical event, a surprising biographical turn of events, a fateful encounter, an eye-opening reading, a happy moment in general, to divine provenance would short-circuit God's action with a causal influence." And so he's basically saying, well, what Boyle is doing here is he's using this kind of model of knowledge that we know from natural science, and he's just applying it to the philosophy of religion. He's saying, well, if we have this vocabulary, why don't we just apply it to the world and see if that kind of works, right? And so that's a kind of a pragmatist model of gaining knowledge, and Habermas negates that this would be possible precise because we don't have the same kind of falsification methods that we would have in a controlled experiment. And specifically, well, I think I'm just going to go to the next slide. So this is, I'm sorry for all the text in this. This is my own writing here. I'm trying to defend Boyle, and what I'm really trying to say is that Boyle doesn't really realize how radical his own idea here is. I think that Boyle and both Boyle and Habermas are both still thinking implicitly about a kind of a theistic picture where God is outside of the objective world, and even if we follow Boyle and we turn things around and we kind of think about phenomena first and then try to ascertain whether it's useful to speak of them in terms of religious vocabulary, I think that this is still using a kind of an outdated understanding of what the divine would, what role that would play in relationship to the objective world. And so what I'm claiming specifically is this: by thinking about the divine in terms of something that could have a causal influence upon the here and now, one already departs from the epistemic picture of realism without representation. One posits an objective world and then adds an additional divine entity that could somehow influence that world. Habermas is still thinking in terms of a form of theism, i.e. a worldview that separates the world and God. But at its most radical point, Boyle's position can be understood differently. When Boyle writes, within a realism without representation, the sentence E is an act of God, is an interpretation of reality that competes with other interpretations of reality, this can be taken to mean that we precisely do not suppose that there is an entity, God, outside of the world. Instead, the question is whether the linguistic categories associated with the term God are a practically useful way to understand our situations here and now. If they are, then the truth of God is exclusively situated in the pattern that I am referring to, with the linguistic assertion and the pragmatic success of conducting myself along this word-disclosive vocabulary. So basically what I'm arguing is, if the vocabulary is successful in the here and now, then the truth that I'm referring to is not the divinity outside the objective world. It's truly only precisely what I'm referring to here and now, right? And so this, I think this sounds quite abstract, and I think that it gets much clearer if you kind of think about concrete cases where we might talk about these things. So what I want to end on basically is the question, when is it useful to speak and act in relation to God? So what are the concrete referents of religious speech in the here and now if we don't suppose that there is a kind of extra objective world divinity that has some kind of causal influence upon what we experience here and now? And specifically who I want to draw on here is Hartmut von Sass, who is another theologian, and I'm drawing on Hartmut von Sass specifically because Habermas has this whole interaction with him where he it was perhaps one of the last things that Habermas ever wrote. It was a birthday wish to Thomas M. Schmidt, who died, I think, very soon after that as well. And apparently Thomas M. Schmidt had recommended a particular publication of Hartmut von Sass to Habermas, and Habermas goes and writes his birthday wish and kind of comments in that this is all absolute nonsense, basically saying that this is basically just, I think, atheistically undefined talk, basically. He says that Hartmut von Sass is unspecific, and that what he's getting at is really not true Christianity or true religion in any case. But I think that Habermas is wrong in this count again. And so what I want to point to specifically as an example of one specific referent of religious speech as the topic of hope. So I think it was quite nice that you ended on the topic of hope, because I think that that's where I want to pick up again. So Hartmut von Sass has this whole paper where he describes first the phenomenology of hope and then the religious dimension of hope. And he argues that from a phenomenological perspective, what hope is a way of, on the one hand, relating to the actual, and on the other hand, also orienting oneself to something that is yet to come, right? So we're hoping for some future turn of events. But what Hartmut von Sass is doing here is he's simultaneously claiming that this phenomenology of hope also maps onto a kind of religious practice. So what he says is, hope comes close to trust in God, is nearly synonymous with God's reality itself. Hope lives in the difference between the present and the future, between what instantly passes away and what awaits on the horizon of a still passing present. To live in hope is to live suspensefully, to abide in this tension. So basically, what Hartmut von Sass is claiming here is that by orienting ourselves towards something of a desired future state, we are already implicitly acting out a type of belief. And of course, there's also this kind of narrative dimension here of, say, the Exodus story, where the entire narrative is structured around the idea of going towards the desired land, the desired future. And so what is happening here is this kind of articulation of the interlocking of the phenomenological perspective on hope, on the one hand, and the theological articulation of hope. And so I think this is important because I think that this is one particular instance in which the Habermasian account can be shown to kind of lack this understanding of a particular referent of religious speech. And so I continue writing here. Are these two things, the desired future state and the attitude of aiming towards it, i.e. hope, entities in the objective world? Yes, albeit complex ones. Hope is an attitude towards the actual that is oriented towards a hypothetical, purely potential future state. Hope and the receptivity towards the pure potential of being that it supposes can therefore be understood as a phenomenon in the objective world that simultaneously retains a religious character. This is one example in which, or so I argue, Habermas' conception of belief and his theory of the way in which the Enlightenment scientific breakdown of religious thought can be observed to be wrong. The reference of what is called religious belief and the reference of a religious worldview are not radically transcendent to this world. They are part of the objective world that we can refer to, even if they are, to the modern mind that is accustomed to think first and foremost about the entities in terms of material objects, harder to localize. And so this is basically the end point of what I want to talk about. Basically what I'm trying to do in my thesis is to articulate a much broader picture, much lengthier account of what these referents of religious speech might be. And one of these is concretely what I term the so I wrote a paper called The Neurophenomenology of Breakdown, and so I discuss how if you, for example, if you have an extremely difficult life situation and you are able to overcome this, then that's a kind of personal transformation that is going on there, right? And so what is mirrored in this kind of transformative experience is the type of kind of redemptive way of death and rebirth that is sometimes referred to that is not something, but that is integral to, for example, the Christian tradition, right? And so that I think there's this kind of parallel going on between, I would say, the phenomenology of lived experience, especially in relation to the pure potential of the future and what could yet be, and on the other hand, the religious articulation of this in religious narrative. And what I'm trying to do is basically showing that Habermas not only misses these phenomenological things, but that his entire, I would say his entire epistemology is kind of unequipped to understand these, precisely because he only ever thinks about communicative action and not about lived experience. I think that's basically it.